Isaac Newton once said, "I am only a child playing on the beach, whilst vast oceans of truth lie undiscovered before me." Well, he certainly understood something about our understanding. It is a very human affliction that we suffer from the comforting pretense that we actually understand the world. It gives us structure, predictability, a solid surface to stand on. When you touch a table, it feels real. If you open your mouth, words come out as if you meant them. If you read a book, you probably feel wiser for it. What about your decisions? They're probably kind of rational, right? Well, behind all of this confidence lies a more humbling reality. The table, in fact, isn't as solid as you might think it is. Our thoughts definitely aren't as stable as we think they are, and knowledge generally isn't very long-lasting. In fact, the entire person who you think you are might be mostly fiction. Hello, and welcome to the Growth Mindset Psychology Podcast with me, Sam Webster Harris, diving into the science of self-improvement and the philosophy of what it all means. Today, we're looking at things like cognitive bias, false memories, and the Dunning-Kruger effect. And what do they all have in common? They remind us how unreliable our minds can be. So to get a grasp of ourselves and be slightly less wrong, I think it's going to be a lot of fun as we ask ourselves how much of what we think we know is actually true. Coming up after the break. Okay, let's go back to 1911. At the time, physicists believed that they had a pretty decent grasp on what everything was made of. There was a leading model by J. Thomson called the plum pudding theory. And it was a vague idea that we basically have blobs of positive goo with negative charged electrons embedded through them, a bit like a pudding with raisins in it. And it sounded scientific enough for the time, and it looked great in textbooks, so people assumed it was right and they moved on. Then Ernest Rutherford came along. He did what is now a very famous experiment by directing a beam of positively charged particles at an ultra-thin sheet of gold foil. And if this whole plum pudding model was correct, then the particle beams would pass straight through without any deflection. But that's not what happened. Instead, most particles went straight through, kind of as predicted, but some bounced back violently as if they had hit something incredibly dense. Rutherford even said it was as if he had fired a 15-inch shell at a piece of tissue paper and it came back and hit him. Eventually, what he worked out was that atoms are mostly empty space, and within that vast emptiness lies a very dense nucleus right in the center. And if you put it in perspective, if you imagine the nucleus of an atom were the size of a marble, and you put it in the middle of a football stadium, then the electrons passing around it would be basically specks of dust swirling around the outer walls of that stadium. And the rest is nothing. And the really weird thing about this is that everything is made of atoms. And so that means any solid object that you might hold, the bodies that we live in that are made of atoms, the earth that we walk on, they are all 99.999% nothing. We live in a world of illusions, and the illusion of solidity might be the easiest one to spot compared to what we're going to talk about today. And now that we've moved on by like a good century, we understand a common knowledge that atoms are mostly empty space, but our feelings don't update so easily. The table in front of us still feels very solid. Your body still feels reliable. And what about your mind? Yeah, feels pretty good. Our beliefs are probably true, right? Well, that is the first great lie of the human experience. If it feels true, it must be true. The second lie, which is that knowing something once means we'll still know it later. If you think about how we learn, when you read a book or listen to a podcast, maybe attend a seminar, in the moment, it feels like you're really learning stuff. You're nodding, highlighting, even smiling at how insightful something is. And then weeks later, nothing remains. It's all gone. This effect has been mapped out onto the forgetting curve, which shows that we forget basically half of what we learn within a day and about 90% within a week. The only way to stop that is to actively revisit it and test the material. Hence why I do end the show inviting you to pause and reflect. Sadly, what happens is most of our so-called wisdom evaporates the moment it stops being useful. Or worse, it might even linger around as a false memory, perhaps a polished echo of something we never really understood, fooling us to think we know more than we do. Salvador Dali even said, "The difference between false memories and true ones is the same as for jewels. It's always the false ones that look the most real, the most brilliant. And what this leads to is that we can all walk around thinking we might be experts at things. We can quote books that we've barely finished. We can offer advice that we don't apply. We might even believe we understand other people because we've heard their side of things. But what we actually understand is how we are interpreting their side, not how they actually experience the world. This isn't just a failure of memory, this is a failure of understanding the limits of our own knowledge. Something that Socrates knew very well. When he was asked why he was considered the wisest man in Athens, he said, "I am wise because I know that I know nothing." Whereas the rest of us, on the other hand, we often know nothing or very little, but we believe that we know lots of things. So picture this, for example. You're at a dinner party, someone brings up a hot topic, say the housing crisis or AI, mental health, whatever, and you feel a reaction rise. You know something and you've read a few articles, listened to a debate, so you jump in with an opinion. And then someone asks a follow-up question on your opinion and it's quite specific. And you suddenly found yourself in deep water looking a bit foolish and you quickly become aware that you don't know as much as you thought you did. Well, possibly what happened is you fell for the Dunning-Kruger effect, a psychological phenomenon where people with the least competence tend to feel the most confident. And this happens because ignorance is actually invisible to the ignorant. You can't feel a lack of knowledge. The old saying that you don't know what you don't know. Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel-winning psychologist, did a lot of work on how humans think and make decisions, and his concept of System 1 and System 2 thinking is very useful. System 1 is the fast, emotional, automatic response, and System 2 is the slow, deliberate, analytical side of you that actually sits down and digests the information to really work out the answer. And most of the time, we're in System 1. We don't actually think, we react. We grab the first idea that feels right and we run with it. And this is made worse by a further effect that, as Daniel Kahneman says, nothing in life is as important as you think it is whilst you are thinking about it. And so with this importance that we place on our poorly researched assumptions, we can then misjudge others. We might even misjudge ourselves, and we just remember things selectively and forget constantly and just assume things wildly. But the worst part of all of this is definitely that all of the thoughts that pass through our heads are accepted as facts. All of this actually makes it astoundingly hard to really know ourselves. But let's pause firstly to think about how we understand other people. We might read their expressions and hear their stories and assume that we understand them. But actually, it's kind of similar to the atom I was talking about earlier. There's a vast amount of emptiness between what we see and what is actually there. I'm sure we probably all know someone who thinks that they understand everything and everyone. They assume they are the master of relationship advice. They can solve any of your problems just by telling you what to go and do already. They'll even lecture their doctor about how to do their job. And yes, these people are idiots. We are all a little bit closer to them than we'd like to think. You see, the human mind is a pretty poor translation device. We might hear someone describe their trauma or their joy or their business problem, and our brain immediately runs it through our own personal filter, our experiences. We match it to our own life, our own reactions, and our own vocabulary. And so we can tell ourselves that we get it. But most of the time we don't, not really. Our experience is not their experience. Our emotional palette, childhood, our traumas, desires, none of these are neutral things. And so we are not a clear lens, we are a kaleidoscope. This leads us to forget just how tiny our window into the world really is. Our personal experience accounts for an absurdly small fraction of the possible different life experiences humans could have. And so it's as if we've watched a few seconds of a 10-hour film and we think we've understood the whole plot. So what happens when someone else shares a story with us, whether it's heartbreak or startup advice, our brains will do two unhelpful things. We will project our worldview onto it and assume that they live in the same world that we do. Now, this of course is incorrect. Two people raised in the same neighborhood could live in emotionally foreign countries. One could grow up feeling safe, the other afraid, one supported, the other invisible. And if you multiply this by billions of combinations across cultures, classes, personalities, then that means actually having empathy as a human is basically a miracle of imagination. Like, it's so much harder than you probably could think it is. The good news is you don't actually have to be perfect at understanding others. You just need to be aware of how bad you are at it. And this awareness alone really makes us a lot more patient, more curious, less righteous, because ultimately the mistake isn't in failing to understand others. The mistake is thinking you have already succeeded. Okay, now let's look at some logic. It's not just our empathy that's pretty terrible. Our ability to reason is also a bit useless. Let's say you try to think deeply about something complicated without writing it down. You'll notice that your mind probably doesn't stay put. It'll wander, it loops, it forgets where it was, it gets distracted by random emails or a memory or a neater snack. The brain is not a library or an organized filing cabinet. It is more of a storm. So what's actually going on when we attempt to solve problems or do some internal reflection is we typically make a few mistakes. Firstly, we jump to the first answer that feels right using our system 1, or we just get distracted and abandon the thought mid-process. Or if it's something we're obsessed about, we keep on thinking about it to death when possibly there's nothing we can do about it and there's lots of other more important things we could be doing. Regardless, we rarely actually finish our reasoning process, and we either feel finished or we never finish because we don't know how to think about it logically. And this is why journaling, whiteboarding, or even talking out loud is so powerful. It gives you a way to put structure on something that's formless. Your thoughts are formless, and structure can pin them down. As they say, writing is thinking, and to write well is to think clearly, which is why it's so hard. When you're thinking about things in your head, it's like doing surgery in the dark. You might stumble across something important, but a lot of the time, you're just moving pieces around randomly and calling it insight. You have to remember that the brain is excellent at generating ideas, and it's truly terrible at tracking them. And that's why you have to record things and strip these thoughts of their cozy safety net and put the pure, naked form onto paper, which leads us into decisions and failures, coming up after the break. This cognitive mess that we've been learning about so far doesn't just apply to abstract thinking, it also haunts our everyday decisions. We might tell ourselves that we are good at driving or choosing romantic partners, or perhaps we're great at buying the right groceries. Well, how do you actually know these things? You don't really have a feedback loop, and there's no scoreboard tracking how often you're wrong, unless you happen to have an especially annoying partner that always reminds you. But I would say that many times we wouldn't even be able to say if we were wrong because we have no comparison or control condition. There's no simulation running in a parallel universe to show us what would happen if we'd chosen a different decision, right? So then what do? How do we get any feedback? Well, we just make it up and rationalize it all away. Our project failed. Well, the market shifted. It was unfortunate timing, or maybe a date ghosted you. Well, they probably weren't ready or weren't the right person. Or perhaps no one listens to your podcast. Well, it's hard to grow a podcast these days, so definitely not your fault. The issue, of course, with these explanations is that we don't learn from our mistakes at all if we can't see them as mistakes. If we're pinning the blame on external causes, that's giving up ownership of the problem, which means that you can't deal with it. And this isn't just coming from your ego, it's also coming from survival. As Charles Darwin once said, the very essence of instinct is that it is followed independently of reason. In other words, we're built to act on things and not actually to reflect on them. That was a survival and reproduction mechanism of our ancestors, but today, in a complex modern world, it does backfire a little spectacularly sometimes. So I'll give you a concrete list of examples that show our flawed cognition when it comes to things like planning. For example, 95% of smokers who try to quit fail. 90% of startups fail in their first year. 67% of gym memberships go unused. 50% of political promises are never delivered, and 22% of marriages end within 5 years. So we're very optimistic, self-assured, full of conviction that whatever we're doing is the thing that we're going to do, yet we are basically wrong most of the time. There's the famous planning fallacy, also coined by Daniel Kahneman and his co-researcher Amos Tversky, if that's how it's said. Who am I fooling? That is obviously not how it's said, Sam. I wonder if Amos and Daniel did exactly the same amount of research, and Daniel Kahneman is just mega famous because people can actually say his name. Poor guy, Amos. Well, I've got your back, Amos, even if I can't say Tversky or however your name is said. Moving on, I'm running a podcast. Well, the planning fallacy describes our tendency to underestimate the time, cost, and risks of our future actions, even when we know that similar past projects have run over budget and schedule. However, of course, we believe that this time it will be different, but it almost never is. And I'm sorry if this was a bit depressing, which it probably wasn't because I just distracted you with a terrible pronunciation of Amos Tversky's name. But I'll remind you, I was talking about the stats that we fail at everything like our marriages, our gym memberships, or our startups, which nicely makes the point about how easily distractible we are. But actually, this is a kind of liberating realization. And I'll tell you why. When you finally accept that you are a biased, forgetful, overconfident, easily distracted, poorly informed emotional tornado of a human being, well, I think it's kind of magical. You can stop expecting yourself to be perfect, and you can also start building systems to compensate for your flaws. And here's two big opportunities for you that I think come from this acceptance. The first one is to really focus on reliability. Now, most people overpromise, underdeliver, their plans fall apart, their timelines slide, their systems break. So if you can do what you said you were going to do, when you said you would do it, you become a very, very rare person. And if you want to be more reliable, there's a few options. Firstly, do less stuff. Most tasks will take longer than they're worth doing, and it's better to just prioritize and do a few things. Next, write down your plans, because as we know, thinking is not remembering. And finally, try and use some accountability. Have deadlines. Talk to other people. Talk to your journal. Keep things written down and out of your head so they're actually being thought about properly. In fact, when I was running my startup in Techstars, they said that one of the most important things you can do to impress investors and get investment is to just be reliable as a founder. If a founder says that they're going to do 5 things in the next few months and then they go and do them, that's very impressive. Because then whatever else you say you're going to do over next year, it starts to feel believable. And sure, a reliable person probably isn't very flashy, but they are unstoppable. Now, the other big opportunity you have is to build your resilience, which is a topic we talk a lot about here on The Growth Mindset. And we did have a great episode on mental strength last month if you want to dive into it more. But for now, think about this. When things go wrong, we often collapse into anger or shame or blame. But these are all knee-jerk reactions, system 1 thinking again. Now, what you want to build is a more powerful alternative that's developing emotional agility, the ability to experience emotions without being owned by them. And that requires curiosity. It requires slowing down. Remember what I said earlier about the big first lie that we have is believing our feelings, believing our emotions. Just because we feel something doesn't mean we have to react to it. And that brings us to a story. There's a famous parable of the Chinese farmer where one day his horse runs away. Now, his lovely neighbors are very sad for him. They tell him what bad luck it was, and they offer him help. And the farmer says, we'll see. Then the next day, the horse returns, but he brings 3 other wild horses with him. And the neighbors are overjoyed. What good luck, they say. The farmer nonchalantly goes, we'll see. Well, the next day, the farmer's son tries to tame one of the new horses, and he falls from a rowdy horse and breaks his leg. Oh, how terrible, the neighbors say. You won't be able to farm the fields properly, etc. And the farmer, of course, goes, we'll see. Then, a week later, the army comes to draft all able-bodied young men. And the farmer's son, of course, is spared. Oh, you're so lucky, the neighbors say. And of course, the farmer, still deeply equanimous, says, we will see. The lesson, of course, being that we don't know what something means until much later, if ever. So if you react to something with emotional certainty, that's just another form of ignorance. For example, something like this happened in my own life. I was in Lisbon after Web Summit and was about to fly home for my mum's birthday. Then at 2 a.m., my flight was cancelled And I had a few drinks already and was kind of groggy and slightly furious. And I spent a few hours trying to complain to people at the airline who couldn't really do anything. And being a non-shouty person, I didn't shout. I just was unhappy deeply and finally went to bed. The next morning, I had to take a train to Porto to get the only flight I could to get to my mum's birthday on time. And I was sleep deprived, annoyed, and kind of, cursing my bad luck and cursing my mother for her inconvenient birthday choices. But in the queue at the airport, I met a lovely Portuguese lady who became my partner. And now I've lived with her for the last 2 years and life is great. So in retrospect, I'm pretty damn lucky that my flight was cancelled. As you can see, we probably have no idea what an event means in the moment. The idea of good and bad are labels that we can assign very quickly and often wrongly, which is why the real wisdom isn't just knowing that we're wrong, but knowing that we can't even begin to know how we are actually wrong. Okay, so basically I spent this episode trying to teach everyone that we're all idiots, which we are, but I'll put this all together. When you really think about it, it's not just atoms that are mostly nothing. It's your plans, your beliefs, your calendar, your stories about who you are. Even your memories are stitched together by guesswork. So your future, well, it's basically a fiction genre that you've invented in your head. We are creatures that are made of mostly nothing, walking through a world that we barely understand, governed by forces that we can't see, navigating with minds that constantly lie to us. And as I said earlier, it's really kind of wonderful. You can sit with this truth, not as a reason to despair, but as an invitation to wonder. And I think then everything can open up. Your anger can soften. Your certainty about right and wrong or problems in your life can loosen. Your questions can get much better, and you can be less focused on your anxiety or your problems or on things like being right. And you can become more focused on just being a little less wrong. And I think that is a really big foundation for growth. In Adam Grant's book, Think Again, he describes the idea of confident humility. The idea that you can hold your beliefs loosely whilst standing firmly in your values. And it's not weakness, it's a strength, because the people who change the world, they're ones who invent things, create, collaborate, heal, evolve. They certainly aren't people who cling tightly to what they know. Instead, they ask better questions, write things down, they change their minds frequently, they assume that they almost always have missed something, because they probably have, and they can treat each day like a hypothesis and not a verdict. So what can you do with this? Well, I am starting a podcast about how to change the world that is coming very soon, so stay tuned. But in the meantime, you can remember that you don't actually have to become a philosopher or a monk or a neuropsychologist. You just need to understand 3 things. Don't trust every thought that you think, because they probably aren't facts and they're probably more like weather patterns that may or may not come true. Secondly, try and use external tools to extend your brain. That could be writing, speaking, collaborating, testing, reviewing. And finally, just assume that you are probably wrong about some things that are important and try to go find out what it is. So we will end where we began, on the beach with Mr. Newton. Remember, he said that I am only a child playing on the beach whilst vast oceans of truth lie undiscovered before me. Yes, the world is mostly nothing, and so are we. But within that nothingness, there is a little room for awe, wisdom, kind of growth that will only begin when we admit that we don't know things. And that's probably the most honest thing that we can really ever say. So I hope you enjoyed digesting some of these slightly esoteric, irreverent thoughts from philosophy and psychology. If you do happen to know someone that is completely and always giving you advice on how to do your job, though they don't know what they're doing, do share this episode with them to tell them how stupid they are. That is how the show grows after all. The workshop I am running on uncertainty and how to make better decisions is going ahead next week. So there's still time to get a ticket if you are interested. The link is in the description. And if you feel like having a chat, you can book a call with me on Wednesdays or send me an email, because I am a friendly person. So remember, life is short. Don't worry too much about getting it right. Perhaps just try to be a little bit less wrong. And that's all you really need to do. Thank you so much for listening.
Go you!
Your consistency to reach the end of an episode is legendary.
My hero!
If you have any ideas or feedback for the show, I'm always interested to hear from you. Studies show we need time for information to sink in, so I'm going to give you a 5-second pause, silence, to reflect on one idea from the show before you jump back into your busy life. Ready and go.